Week 22, Overview, Eisenhower's Oasis. Welcome to the Eisenhower years. After so much death and destruction in this century, the years after the Korean War seemed like an oasis of peace. Our main focus this week is on American life during Eisenhower's first administration, 1953 to early 1957. For the first time in a generation, Americans had no major catastrophes to deal with. The post-war economy boomed. Most middle-class families could afford a modest new home of their own in the fast-growing suburbs that developed around cities. Most of them drove a car, had a TV, and enjoyed enough income to spend on labor-saving devices and family vacations. Prosperous young families produced a baby boom. Meanwhile, President Eisenhower's first term saw the start of the modern civil rights movement in America, where blacks struggled to gain basic civil rights that the Constitution had promised them nearly a century before. It was also the beginning of America's involvement in Vietnam. The Eisenhower years were calm, but the seeds of the turbulent 60s were taking root. Who was Dwight Eisenhower? He was a successful general who became president, as had George Washington, William Henry Harrison, and Ulysses S. Grant before him. Known as Ike to his friends, Eisenhower had commanded a training center in World War I and then served on General MacArthur's staff between the wars. In 1935, Ike had accompanied MacArthur to the Philippines and served as the assistant military advisor to the Philippine government. In 1939, as World War II was beginning, he had returned to the United States. Eisenhower had moved up in the ranks over the next 2 years and became commander of all U.S. forces in Europe in 1942. He then successfully led the invasion of North Africa and took Italy back from the Germans. He was named Supreme Allied Commander in 1944, where he was responsible for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion at Normandy. He was promoted to a 5-star general and led the Allies in liberating Europe, invading Germany, and accepting Germany's surrender in 1945. After the war, Eisenhower was Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army until 1948, and then became president of Columbia University in New York City. President Truman appointed him Supreme Commander of NATO in 1949, where he served until 1952, when he decided to run for president. By 1952, Democrats had held the White House for 20 years, but Eisenhower's status as a real war hero made him popular with the public. The Red Scare and the Korean War made Americans eager for a leader with military experience. People admired and trusted Eisenhower. He promised he would end the Korean conflict while keeping America strong in the Cold War. Ike won big, getting 55% of the popular vote and 83% of the electoral vote. The Eisenhower era was a time of peace. The Korean War ended with an armistice a few months into his presidency, and the next 8 years became a time of prosperity, not controversy. Politically, Eisenhower made no big changes. He was not primarily a politician. He didn't want to stir things up in Washington. He made no big political moves. In foreign affairs, he wanted to build up America's defenses, keep the peace, and contain the spread of communism. There were no big economic challenges on Ike's watch. The United States experienced a significant, sustained economic boom that brought with it prosperity. People in the post-war period were busy rebuilding America, their families, their suburbs, and their careers. The 1950s saw an explosion of creature comforts. There was more money for consumer goods, and many new labor-saving products came on the market. People had money and time for vacations, education, and new houses, too. The 1950s have been called both the Age of Anxiety and the Age of Contentment. It was the Age of Anxiety because of nuclear weapons and communist expansionism. Yet some call it the Age of Contentment because Americans were content to focus on America and her interests rather than worry about events outside the borders. This could be underscored by Eisenhower's presidency, which was marked by a refocus on America's own economic interests. Spurred on by advertising agencies, America became an ever more materialistic nation in the 1950s, with the introduction of credit cards, fast food, and other consumer conveniences. The 1950s have been called by many the golden age of television. Most middle-class families became able to afford a TV sometime during that decade. TV became the dominant feature in most living rooms and the most common entertainment during most evenings. It was a subtle feature of the decade that families turned from reading aloud or talking together to cluster around the TV. Evening schedules began to be regulated by the times that shows aired. Social interactions inside and outside the family began to be dictated by TV programming. The 1950s saw the birth of the suburbs as we know them now. Americans had squeezed into existing homes in the Great Depression and were too busy building tanks and planes to build homes during World War II. When the soldiers and sailors came home, America experienced a baby boom, a dramatic increase in the number of births. That led to an urgent need for new homes for all the new babies in the 1950s. The automobile contributed to the trend. Affordable cars enabled people to build their homes well outside the city yet still commute into work. The suburbs began to transform American landscapes and lifestyles. Most of the people who left the city and moved to the suburbs were middle-class whites. This meant that those who remained in the city were typically the minorities, who had lower-paying jobs and thus less money. In 1954, the Supreme Court prohibited racial segregation in public schools. The court-ordered integration of the schools only increased the incentives for white middle-class families to move out to the more affluent, mostly white school districts outside the cities. Many cities began a downward spiral. Parents with a decent income no longer wanted to raise their children in the cities. Parents with less money had no choice. The resulting cycle of white flight caused the suburbs to grow as the inner cities decayed. That led to a new socioeconomic divide between the middle-class suburbs and the increasingly poor inhabitants of the cities. When Eisenhower took office in January 1953, 21 states operated what were called separate but equal public schools for black and white children, as permitted by the Supreme Court in the infamous Plessy v. Ferguson case of 1896. 16 months after Eisenhower was sworn in, the Supreme Court ruled, in Brown v. Board of Education, that segregated public schools violated the Constitution's guarantee of equal protection under law. But the court didn't issue any directions about how the states should change their schools. A year later, the Supreme Court answered the outstanding questions of Brown. It didn't order states to let black children into white schools immediately, but instructed the states to begin a gradual, court-enforced process of integration with, quote, all deliberate speed, end quote. The Brown case shocked and angered white Southerners, who declared a campaign of massive resistance to this federal attack on their way of life. But it also stirred a new generation of activists who sought to end American racism. The most famous of these was Martin Luther King, Jr., the man whose importance to America's civil rights movement was as great as Gandhi's was to Indian independence. King was born in Atlanta in 1929, the year the stock market crashed. Young Martin was a bright boy. He skipped 9th and 12th grades and progressed through college, seminary, and graduate school. He got a Ph.D. in theology from Boston College in 1955, and then moved back down south and took a job as a minister, but quickly discovered his life's work, organizing nonviolent protests against racial injustice. King wasn't perfect, but he was a brave man who changed America. It started when one black woman named Rosa Parks went to jail because she refused to give up her seat to a white rider on a city bus. King helped lead a boycott of the segregated public bus system in Montgomery, Alabama. King intentionally followed Gandhi's example of nonviolent non-cooperation, but unlike Gandhi, he articulated his vision in explicitly Christian terms. When terrorists bombed his house in January 1956, King rushed home to find angry black men getting ready to attack the white policemen. He begged them to put their weapons down. King described what happened next in his autobiography. He says that he said, "If you have weapons, take them home. If you do not have them, please do not seek to get them. We cannot solve this problem through retaliatory violence. We must meet violence with nonviolence. Remember the words of Jesus, 'He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword.'" King urged them to leave peacefully. "We must love our white brothers," he said, "no matter what they do to us. We must make them know that we love them." Jesus still cries out in words that echo across the centuries, "Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use you." This is what we must live by. We must meet hate with love. It took more than 1 year and a Supreme Court case, but the city of Montgomery finally agreed to integrate the buses. This was just the beginning of the civil rights movement, a thread we'll be following carefully over the next few weeks. Another major thread that we'll be following also starts this week: Vietnam. France colonized Southeast Asia in the 19th century, but Germany conquered France in World War II. Nazi-controlled France allowed Japan to use Vietnam for military purposes. At first, the Vietnamese welcomed the Japanese, but soon began to resist the Japanese invaders. A Vietnamese communist named Ho Chi Minh rose up to fend off the Japanese, and when the Japanese surrendered in 1945, Chi Minh declared a new Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Unfortunately, France didn't want to give up its colonial possessions, and the United States didn't want a new communist state. France fought to keep its colony, and President Harry Truman started sending aid. Ho Chi Minh turned to Mao's China for help, and was able to push the French forces back. France asked for more American aid, which Eisenhower sent, although not as much as the French wanted or needed. The French were losing the war, but Ike wasn't willing to commit America to another Korea. America was actively but quietly opposing communism around the world at this point, not by sending soldiers, but by sending money, weapons, and secret agents. Ike's cautious choices kept the peace, for the time being. But in hindsight, it wasn't peace, just the calm before the storm. There were seeds planted in the 1950s that would soon sprout up, bearing bitter fruit.